Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today in this first international conference of the recently created Oman Psychiatric Society. I would like to congratulate Dr. Awalavi and all our friends from Oman for creating this new society. This will be for sure an important way to dissemination of the advances in psychiatry. Today I'm going to talking a little bit about targeting neuroplasticity and brain metabolism in depression and bipolar disorder. I'm Dr. Elisa Brietzke. I am a full professor at the Department of Psychiatry in Queen's University in Canada. This is my disclosure. I have some research grants from CMO, the university, and the PSI Foundation. I am also a speaker and advisory board member of an association, an Institute for Personalized Nutrition. I'm a member of the CanMat, and I'm the co-lead of a task force on nutrition and exercise from the International Society for Bipolar Disorders. We have three objectives in this conference. First, we are going to identify the synapses as the critical target for new treatments in mood disorders, and also understand the actions of metabolic modulators and metabolic molecules in the synapses and in the synaptic plasticity. Then we are going to explore a little bit how we can target the synapses using systemic molecules and systemic treatments. Specifically, we are going to approach exercise and diet. And finally, we are going to recognize some gaps in the literature and what is still have to be explored in psychiatry and what we can expect in terms of future advances in the field. So let's start with mood disorders as diseases of the synapses. It is largely recognized that depression and bipolar disorder are very complex entities. They happen due to a combination of risk factors and causal factors that for sure genetics is one of them, but also environmental factors which combine with the genetic background during the intrauterine life, during the childhood and adolescence, and during the adult life to promote changes in the brain substrate that will be recognized as important for the pathophysiology of mood disorders. So we are talking about, for example, things like stress, and this can be understood both as a childhood maltreatment, which leads to HPA abnormalities and cortisol abnormalities and the cortisol toxicity in the brain, but also psychosocial stress in the adult life. And then we are specifically talking about grief or financial stress, domestic violence, things that can impact the brain, which comes from the uterus with some predisposition for a mood disorder. We also have the exposure to substances, alcohol, drugs, and other substances, the hormonal fluctuations that everyone has, but especially women, can present during critical periods, such as, for example, postpartum period, or during the fluctuations of the menstrual cycle. And we have like the malnourishment with the lack of nutrients. We are going to talk in detail later in this presentation how the overconsumption of ultra-processed food can predispose someone to depression. So all these risk factors, interestingly, they converge to a single target, which is the synapses. With the synaptic malfunctioning, especially in some specific areas of the brain, we are talking about limbic areas, such as the hippocampus, a highly reproduced region as to be abnormal in depression, but we are also talking about prefrontal cortical areas. All these changes in the synapses will lead to abnormalities in neurotransmitters like serotonin, noradrenaline, and dopamine, which have been recognized since the 50s as important or as relevant in the pathophysiology of mood disorders, but also in things like the cognitive decline. Finally, these changes in the brain also have been related with changes in the eating behavior, in the energy balance in the body. And we are specifically talking about reduction or increase of appetite, reduction of increase of energy levels, which can lead to early mortality. The expression of all those things are the metabolic disorder symptoms, are, for example, mood symptoms. And what happened, especially due to the mood symptoms, a little bit due to the cognitive decline as well, is that we have impairments in functioning. So we can understand here, since starting in the genome, we have the environment working in the epigenome. We have the interaction between genetic and environmental factors, which have an impact in the way that the neurons do the gene transcription, the protein production, and finally the signaling pathways in the brain, which are responsible for a normal brain activity. So we can understand mood disorders and we can understand healthy synapses as the synapses which are constantly adapting through mechanisms of neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, more classically, refers to things like, for example, synaptic remodeling, dendritic arborization, the axonal activity, the increase of the number or reduction of the number of synaptic spine. So we can understand this process as being part of the pathophysiology of mood disorders, and our treatments would have not simply the role or the objective to replace or to increase the levels of the certain neurotransmitters, but have a primary objective of restoring synaptic function. The thing is that all the processes that happen in the synapses, they are they consume energy. They are active processes. When we talk about, for example, reuptake of neurotransmitters from the synaptic cleft, when we talk about like making more synaptic vesicles with noradrenaline inside, or when we talk about like gene transcription, all of this consume energy. And the structure in the cell that makes energy, that produces energy, is mitochondria. So mitochondria has been identified as a critical target in mood disorders. We have some studies showing that individuals with mood disorders, depression and bipolar disorder, they have an increase of oxidative stress, which is a marker of mitochondrial dysfunction, an increase of apoptosis, which is another marker of mitochondrial dysfunction, but not only. So at this point, mitochondria is like a whole world inside the mood disorders study, and we are just starting to understand how this important structure can regulate, for example, synaptic actions. So at this point, if we think that mitochondria is a critical structure for synaptic function, then we can also put this in the table as a potential target. So as a key, a take-home message, I would like you guys have the idea that major depressive disorder and also bipolar disorder are better understood as diseases of the synaptic dysfunction resulting from the interaction of multiple biological systems during the whole life of the individual, started in the intrauterine life, rather than a deficiency of one single nutrient or just a few neurotransmitter. So what is the evidence when we go to the neuroimaging studies? We have studies showing a metabolic dysfunction in different areas in the brain in mood disorders. But as I mentioned to you, they concentrate in two main areas, two main regions. So in the limbic structures and also in the prefrontal and temporal structures. So it is possible to identify a number of metabolic abnormalities in this region, but it is also possible to investigate the glucose metabolism directly in the brain. So here we have in the right part of this slide, we have a comparison between individuals with depression with healthy controls. And what we see here is that there is a decrease of metabolism in the green areas in insula and limbic system and basal ganglia, and an increase of metabolism in the thalamus and cerebellum in patients with MDD compared to healthy controls. So if the brain is using more glucose, there is something happening there in the way that the synaptic function has been happening in that brain. Well, synapses are part of the story, but they are not the whole story, okay? So a second part of this story is that mood disorders not only happen in the synapses of the brain, but they are also systemic illnesses. It was well demonstrated and largely reproduced that individuals with MDD and BD, they have an increased risk for cardiovascular and metabolic comorbidity and mortality. This increase is so relevant that there is like a reduction in about 15 years of life expectancy in individuals with bipolar disorder compared to general population, and reduction in about 7 years, between 5 to 10 years, in individuals with MDD. Cardiovascular burden is multifactorial, and it comes from different it has different origins. So we have the adverse metabolic effects of medications, we have the inequalities in healthcare, we have the poor lifestyle factors, but there is also something intrinsic to mood disorders that is related, that works in this comorbidity. So we have genetic factors that can predispose the individual at the same time to cardiovascular morbidity and to mood disorders. We have early life stress, specifically childhood maltreatment. We are talking specifically about things like sexual abuse and neglect during childhood, which are at the same time risk factors for depression, but also for obesity and diabetes and metabolic disorders. And we have other factors which are intrinsic to the pathophysiology of the disease, which in the studies are reflected by the demonstration that even individuals who never receive any kind of medication have an increase of cardiovascular risk. So there is something happening in depression and MDD that should make us think that this is not purely a comorbidity, that the association between medical morbidity and mood disorder is much more complex than that. This made some authors to propose a specific subtype of depression, which would be like a metabolic or an immunometabolic uh, subtype of depression. So, according to these authors, between 20 to 30 of the individuals with MDD, for example, would have a specific type of depression, which is marked for like atypical energy related symptoms, like, for example, increased of appetite, fatigue, anhedonia. And when we take the blood of these people and we examine immune and metabolic biomarkers, we can have abnormalities in the immune system, especially in mediators, which suggests the existence of low-grade um, immune or inflammatory activation, and also in the changes and abnormalities in the glucose and insulin metabolism. It is unclear how these factors directly correlate to each other. It is unclear if people with anhedonia have more inflammation, or which kind of inflammation process is more associated with anhedonia and with glucose and insulin. Things are a bit confused, but there is a proposal on the table that maybe we should have a subcategory of depression, which would be like the metabolic subtype of depression. So this would be a categorical approach. There is another approach, which is a more dimensional approach, which comes from the idea that every symptomatic dimension, every domain of biological domain that each biomarker reflects is a dimension. That things are not as simple as, this is like, there is like an immunometabolic subtype, yes or no. The person can have abnormalities in some metabolic systems and not in others, in a way that makes the things much more complex. We are basically dealing with the idea that depression and metabolism are multidimensional, and that we have, of course, this phenotypical convergence. We have this phenotypical convergence mediated or moderated by shared pathophysiological mechanisms, including multiple neural system and peripheral homeostatic system, as well as to be underlined by common genetic and environmental factors. So these authors, which especially Dr. Rodrigo Mansour from Toronto, proposed the idea that there is a metabolic mood syndrome that can be identified not only in our patients who have metabolic abnormalities, but also in the individuals who are patients from services from bariatric surgery, for example, or from diabetes or from obesity treatment. So the concept of MMS recognizes that the association between mood disorders and metabolic syndrome is multidimensional and complex, and may be represented by different clinical phenotypes. The clinical validity and how this can inform treatments remain to be determined. We have a third approach, which is like a predictive approach. Is the idea that it's possible to define in a large group of individuals with mood disorders metabolic biosignature. And we are not only talking about one metabolic biosignature, we can have more than one. So the idea is to use methods like machine learning and big data analytics to examine very large samples of individuals with these pathologies, and try to recreate for each person what would be the metabolic pathway of depression and bipolar in the brain of that specific patient. So this will make us closer than the idea that we see in oncology of n equal 1, the idea that there's no two breast cancer that are exactly the same. There is no two responses or two patients that respond exactly the same to different treatments. So in the same idea that oncology takes like a biopsy, a little piece of a tumor, and check the genetic profile and the markers and what is in the surface of this cell of the tumor, to define subtypes or to define like a profile or a biosignature. The idea is to do this for mood disorders as well. This became possible due to the rapid development of computational tools. However, psychiatry is still, I would say, below this development. The ISBD has a big data analytics task force, and the last paper specifically talking about this is from 2019. So we hope that soon we have another positional paper talking about those things, because we have like a rapid development in the past 7 years. But this is something that we can expect for the future. Finally, we have our second objective, which is how local and systemic metabolic factors can be translated in the synapses. And then it's important for us to recognize the idea of metabolic plasticity. Metabolic plasticity is, again, a concept from oncology, and it has to do with the ability of the cells to dynamic reprogram their energy production pathways in order to survive or to continue to work well, even under fluctuations of nutrient availabilities, oxygen levels, or stress. So if from an oncology perspective, it would be bad if you have a tumor cell with more metabolic plasticity. For us, it would be good, because it would mean that our brain would be more adaptable to fluctuations in our environment. So these fluctuations in environment can be, for example, metabolic challenges like cognitive tasks, or like changes in the hormonal environment of our body, aging, psychological stress and trauma, sleep deprivation, medical illnesses, etc. So we could understand our metabolic brain metabolism as being healthy if it is plastic. So healthy systems, in other words, are the ones that are adaptive, but that are also flexible to changes in the environment and to changes in the system as well. Okay, so we have, for example, the neuroplasticity of the mood episodes. We are specifically talking about a concept of neuroprogression, which is the idea that after each mood episode, the brain becomes more prone to react with new mood episodes, even with minor triggers. So we can say that our brain is losing metabolic plasticity with the evolution of chronic depression or chronic bipolar disorder. One example of how important this is this, and of course this is totally like anecdotal, but it's a nice story. We have on top of this right part of this slide, we have like the final of the world chess champion in 1884, in which Karpov, which is the guy on the left, was the world champion, was challenged by Kasparov, which was much younger, but certainly had like, a BMI higher than Karpov. And he was like bigger and has more muscles and was more metabolically more, we can say, plastic. So just staying, and both of players were really good. So this final match always was always ending in a tie. So they play for 3 months until Kasparov was considered the winner because Karpov lost a significant amount of weight, even just seated and playing chess. So this is in line with the observation that our brain, although it's a very small organ, it concentrates like 20% of the use of energy from of the glucose that our body consumes. So let's come back to our figure. We have on the left all the risk factors, we have in the right all the changes that we see and the synapses and how this translates to mood symptoms and functioning. So what is happening so far is that our treatments, they are basically targeting what happens in what precedes the synapses or what it comes after the synaptic plasticity. So we have, for example, psychoeducation to address risk factors for synaptic dysfunction. For example, every time we say to a patient that they shouldn't use substances, we are working in the synapses. We can target what happened in the synapses, for example, with conventional antidepressants, or we can try to modulate the mood symptoms and to restore functioning, for example, using psychotherapy. And these are all useful things, but this is not but they are not perfect. And a lot of patients, and I'm sure you are familiar with this data, 30% of the individuals who start a first-line antidepressant will not respond. 1/3 of them will have an incomplete response, and only 1/3 of our patients with MDD will be lucky enough to respond to a first-line antidepressant. And these are classic data from the STAR*D study. So how we can target the synapses and which treatments do we have so far then do that? We have basically 2 treatments in psychiatry that we can say, okay, this is something that provokes like a massive synaptic remodeling. One of them is ECT. So with the massive release of neurotransmitters and with the activation of a lot of synapses which are a bit lazy with a seizure, we have like a massive synaptic remodeling. And this is probably the reason why ECT is so powerful in the treatment of depression, and why ECT is effective in, for example, older patients in which there is less metabolic flexibility and less synaptic plasticity. The other one is lithium with its action in the second messengers, that we have significant evidence that lithium can potentially prevent deterioration in bipolar disorder, and that lithium can potentially modify the course of illness, reducing like cyclicity and preventing very severe outcomes such as suicide. However, it is possible, if mood disorders are systemic illnesses, that we can target synapses changing the body. And we have basically 2 interventions that were designed with this in mind, which are the physical exercise and the diet. So first of all, let's take a look in the physical exercise. It's important for us to know that exercise is benefit for a lot of things in the body, and that exercise operates through a lot of possible pathways. So we have, for example, robust evidence that exercise increases factors like BDNF, neurotrophic factors, and BDNF is critical in mood disorders. We know that a lot of mood episodes, they are associated with low BDNF levels, Exercise is an anti-inflammatory intervention. It releases uh, lots of mediators in the body. We are talking about endorphins. We are talking about the cannabinoid system. We are talking about like activation of systems that go beyond like the monoaminergic symptoms. But exercises release, the muscles release specifically substances that started to be investigated in mood disorders, which are called exerkines. Like they are hormones released by the muscle. And the most important of them is irisin. Irisin is released with the skeletal muscle contracts, and after being in the body, it has multiple actions, including an action in the brain. And in the brain, irisin was related with cognitive actions, with neurogenesis, and with control of neuroinflammation. We have some evidence that maybe irisin can be important in the action of exercise in prevention of dementia, but we also have studies from animal models showing that irisin expression is lower in animal models of depression, but also lower in patients with depression. So we are probably exploring. We probably found a way in which, for example, doing weight exercise can have an impact, a direct impact in the brain. This is not the only one. We have, for example, the effect of exercise in making the individual lose fat and increase the lean mass. And when the person loses fat, we have reduction, or we have like changes in the fat tissue metabolism, which is active from the hormonal perspective. So we are specifically talking about production of leptin and adipokine. So, but now what we have in terms of what is new for psychiatry is the exerkines, specifically the irisin. So how we can translate this in clinical practice? The ISBD created a nutrition and exercise task force, which is called NEXT, which is co-led by me and Dr. Benny Laffer from Brazil. And we put together a paper which was just accepted to bipolar disorders. It should be available like in 1 week or two, which is called Sedentary Behavior and Physical Activity in Individuals with Bipolar Disorder, an evidence synthesis and positional paper from ISBD, Nutrition and Exercise Task Force. So the first thing that it's important for us to know is that physical exercise is different than physical activity. And the NEXT task force used the WHO definitions, which is the idea that physical activity is any body movement that results in energy expenditure above 1.5 metabolic equivalent of task met. So we have here, for example, things like walking the dog or gardening. This will be considered physical activity. And physical exercise, on the other hand, is like a structured subset of physical activity and generally has the aim to improve or maintain physical fitness. We are specifically talking about cardiovascular endurance, muscular strength, or body composition. And sedentary behavior refers to any behavior that happens when the individual is awake and is characterized by energy expenditure below 1.5 MET. We are typically talking about being seated or reclined. So the interpretation of findings with exercise and physical activity should take into consideration how this was defined and measured. It's important for us to know that not every physical activity is the same. So some people can can only light activity, which is defined as the one that the energy span is between 1.5 and 2.9 mats. So we are talking about like slow walking, washing the dishes, bathing, like, you know, walking inside the house, things like that. The moderate, we are talking about like recreational swimming, carrying boxes, doing a bit more heavy work. And the vigorous, we are talking about like, for example, jogging, running, heavy yard work, or in heavy professional activities. Regarding the domain, there is also some variation. So physical activity can involve leisure time, which are done for like enjoyment or personal fulfilling, like sports or recreational activities. It can be like occupational for those who like it's different if someone spends most of their day seated, or another person is like a waiter, is like someone who spend like the whole time walking and moving. uh, we are talking about like household activities, domestic tasks conducted at home, like cleaning, childcare, gardening, etc., and transport and commuting, like it's the time that the person spend like going and coming back from work. Regardless of the domain, WHO recommends that adults should accumulate 150 to 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity. I know you guys are like, calculating in your minds how much minutes you guys are spending. It's not easy to meet this target. There are certain ways to assess or to calculate if we are meeting or not the WHO target. This is a simple questionnaire called the International Physical Activity Questionnaire. It is freely online, and we can use this for self-assessment, and patients can use this as well. Why? Because if we ask someone, how much time do you spend in physical activity, it can be hard for us to say, oh, I'm meeting or I'm not meeting the WHO target. Another strategy, instead of increasing physical activity, which is similar, analog, but not totally the same, is the reduction of sedentary behavior. Different than physical activity, WHO does not have a recommendation for sedentary behavior. If we go to the literature on cardiovascular diseases, sedentary behavior has been defined as more than 6 to 8 hours per day sedentary, and it increases the risk of cardiovascular diseases and all-cause mortality in general population. So there's no reason to think that people with mood disorders, are more protected against cardiovascular diseases. Actually, it's the opposite. So we can think that the minimum, that would happen in our population is that our patients should stay sedentary less than 6 or 8 hours per day. Prolonged sedentary time has been associated with a range of mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and BD, but especially depression. There are several studies that measure this, but this is a nice study of a large cohort in England, in which they compare like a group of individuals with depression with a group of individuals with no depression. And we can see here that people with depression, they are more sedentary, they spend more time sleeping, less time in light physical activity, but much less time in moderate and vigorous physical activity. Here is like light physical activity. So it means that we need to assess our patient in terms of their sedentary behavior. There is a discrepancy between self-report, even using standardized questionnaires, than when we have, for example, actigraphs, accelerometers, or even like, this disposals that the individual can use to self-track their activity. In general, both methods are considered not perfect, and both of them have advantages and disadvantages. The self-report is like very simple, very easy to obtain, is more contextual. So the patient can say, I spend most of my afternoons not doing anything, or I spend most of my afternoons seated because it's when I'm working. So we know a little bit more. And the accelerometers and actigraphs are more objective, but they are less contextual. So in theory, if we live in the perfect world, we would have data from both of them. We have meta-analysis both in MDD and also in BD, comparing the time in physical activity in patients versus healthy controls. The results we have is that people with MDD, they spend 126 minutes a day in all types of physical activity. So imagine that, the person do something, even light physical activities, for 2 hours of the day. The rest of the day is sedentary. People with BD, probably because, some of them can have like some subthreshold manic symptoms, they spend a bit less. So it's 200 minutes per day being physically active. So individuals with severe mental illnesses, including BD and MDD, are among the most physically inactive groups in the society, often spending more than 10 hours per day sedentary, and very rarely meeting recommendations of physical activity from WHO. So we are specifically talking about a very vulnerable population, which is sad because exercise and physical activity can have benefits that go beyond psychiatric symptom severity, and even targeting symptom severity. It's a lot in this population. We are specifically talking about anxiety, insomnia, but it also reduces the risk of new mood episodes, reduces the risk of hospitalization, improves cognition, and improves functioning. So exercise has a lot of benefits in the brain. Exercise leads to hippocampal neurogenesis, improves synaptic plasticity, improves mitochondria function, improves control of inflammation. So the benefits of exercise go beyond the diagnosis. How this was translated by CanMat. The CanMat, the Canadian Network for Mood and Anxiety Treatments, in its most recent guideline for the treatment of major depressive disorder, established as level 1 recommendation supervised exercise, low to moderate intensity, 30 to 40 minutes a day, 3 to 40 times a week, in a minimum of 9 weeks, as a first-line treatment for a major depressive episode of mild severity. It also classified as a second line or a level 2 recommendation, adjunctive exercise for moderate major depressive episode. Even individuals with severe depression should have as a target to reduce the sedentary time and to increase uh, um, physical activity, even if we are talking about behavioral activation. When we go to clinical practice, things do not translate so easy. And this is a nice recent paper that I recommend to everyone who wants to learn a bit more. It was elaborated by the group that I consider that is the most active at this point in the investigation of the role of exercise in mental health. And what happens is that although we know about the benefits, it's not easy to implement this in clinical practice. First, we have one thing to differentiate, which is the difference between recommend and prescribe, and how recommendations can be done with a lot of differences with the different degrees of assertiveness. So I can include in my appointments general recommendations like, oh, I suggest you exercise every day. This is one thing. Or I can use like exercise, or I can put the same emphasis in exercise that I put in medication, for example. I can say that for mild to moderate depression, we know that medication and exercise are as powerful. Exercise is as powerful as medication, and this is part of the treatment. Okay, so it will make or it will frame exercise in a different way. Regarding safety, we have anecdotal reports saying that individuals with bipolar disorder can have manic switch due to exercise, but this is like extremely, extremely rare. So this group proposes a 5A framework, which is ask, assess, advise, assist, and arrange in terms of how we can intervene with the exercise. Ask is asking about exercise and physical activity. Assess is the use of specific tools. Advice is like, for example, help the patient to understand how powerful the exercise is in terms of mental health and what are the benefits. And the assist and arrange, we are specifically talking about connection of mental health services to gyms, to community centers, to, provide the patient more operational advice and support to start and to maintain physical activity. In the last part of this presentation, I'm going very quickly to talk about diet. The first thing to consider is that there is a biological plausibility for diet as a metabolic treatment in bipolar disorder and in MDD. So we know that diet operates like exercise. It operates or influences the brain through different pathways. So we have the effects of diet in the gut microbiome and in how bacteria that coexist with us in our gut can metabolize some foods that can influence the neurotransmitter production. We also have the glucose and insulin abnormalities. So diet, there's a lot of possible pathways in which diet can influence mental health. However, as physicians, there is a generalized lack of knowledge in nutrition among physicians. So this is a study from the American Heart Association that showed that 71% of the medical schools provide less than the recommended 24 hours in nutrition education to future physicians. And 36% of them provide less than half amount. So psychiatrists and physicians in general, we know very little about nutrition, and when we say something, it's usually very generic and not considered particularly useful by patients. So here we have two options. We can learn a little bit more, and we should. a little bit more about nutrition. And we can have in our teams dietitians that can help to elaborate or to integrate nutrition in the psychiatric or mental health programs. How we should assess metabolic health, both in research and in clinical practice. The simplest thing is to have like a BMI. We know that BMI is not perfect, but it is something, and it helps to have at least like a body weight in every appointment that a patient comes. Regarding diet, we know that diet is related to depression and also is related to suicide. So we have a large study in Japan. Since 2023, this has been demonstrated that a prudent diet is protective against suicide. We have more recently studies showing that ultra-processed food consumption is associated with depression. And these are only 2 studies that I decided to bring to you, but we have a lot of data from different geographic regions with multiple populations showing an association between poor diet and depressive symptoms. So we can say, with 100% of certainty to our patients that they should they should stop eating ultra-processed food and unhealthy food. Diet assessment has the same challenges that exercise assessment, and in the same way, we can just ask to the patient, or we can use like instruments, like food frequency questionnaires, but we can also use, in the same way that you use for exercise, mobile technology and ecological momentary assessment. For example, asking our patient to take a picture of everything they eat during the day and using AI to extract the macronutrients of that diet. Finally, we have a new line of investigation, which is the idea that certain diets can have an antidepressant or a mood stabilizing effect. So the idea is that maybe we can use diet as an intervention. The data that we have so far, the most consistent data, are related to Mediterranean diet, which show some benefit in depression, but the effect size was a bit small. And more recently, we have investigating the ketogenic diet using the concept that maybe mitochondrial function is not the best in MDD and in BD, and giving to the brain a highly efficient fuel, which are the ketone bodies, we can have a therapeutic effect. It is unclear if all these diet interventions produce benefits by themselves, or if this is part of the adoption of a more structured lifestyle. I brought here the results of a study that we just published with ketogenic diet as an adjunctive treatment for moderate to severe depression. That's a pilot study. We have 8 completers, 8 patients completing the study, and you can see that overall all of them but one responded to intervention and came from very high MADRS scores to levels compatible with remission or mild depression. Ketogenic diet has an effect in synaptic remodeling, specifically in keeping excitatory neurotransmitters inside the neuron, not in the cleft. So ketogenic diet also has, being like a diet, also has an effect in the synapses. But of course, these data are preliminary, and we still need like larger randomized controlled studies. Diet is one of the most under-investigated interventions in mood disorders, and there's a lot of problems including how we can translate these findings in food policies, like, for example, price control. And but this is a challenge that is on the table for us for the future. So if we come back to our slide, uh, I hope I convinced you that maybe exercise and diet are possible candidates to be together with ECT and lithium as interventions that can target synapses or synaptic plasticity directly. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts and questions.